Well, hello there, and welcome to another video in this course where we are going to be building a fully functional Skype clone in Flutter. In the previous video, I integrated Firebase to our project and we added our app to the Firebase console. And we also migrated our Flutter app to Android X so as to make it work with all the plugins in their latest versions. Alright, so in this video, I'm going to be starting off with authentication using Google SignIn. So the first thing that I'm going to do is come over to pubspec.yaml and add the latest version of Firebase Auth and Google Sign-In plugins. After that, I'll just sync them. Then I'm going to come over to Firebase console, go to the authentication section, and Firebase lists all the available authentication providers. So you can authenticate users via email and password, or mobile, or you could use Facebook, Google, Twitter, and many more services. Now we are going to be using Google. So click on this little edit icon and just toggle this switch to enable Google Sign-In for your project and click Save. Great. Before moving any further, I would like to point out that a certain amount of logic and code pattern that you can see is borrowed from this repository, which is made and maintained by Mohak Gupta. He built an Instagram clone and I checked out the source code, and the way he has implemented chatting and sign-in is really great and the code quality is amazing. So I would like to thank him for helping me and many others like me, as I was just able to utilize that code without having to write it all on my own. Now, when I work with Firebase, I follow a certain pattern, and thankfully this was the same pattern I found in Mohawk's repository as well. So I first create a folder which will contain all the backend related files. In this case, I'm going to name the folder resources. After that, I will create a file inside of this folder and name it firebase methods.dart, and I will create another file and name it firebase repository.dart. So let me quickly explain why I made two different files. So the first one is firebase methods.dart, and as the name suggests, it contains the definitions of all the Firebase related functions. And this repository file is nothing but a medium for us to communicate with Firebase methods. So we'll call a function inside of the repository, which will then call another function present inside of the firebase methods.dart. Now you might be wondering that why do we need two files for that? Well, first is that it makes the code a bit more clean. Take a look at the finished version of the firebase methods.dart. Look at how many definitions are just lying around. Whereas if you look at the Firebase repository, it seems much cleaner. And you can take a look at all the method calls individually. Coming over to main.dart, I'm going to replace the default code with this one. Here my app is a stateful widget. So those of you who have never worked with Firebase or do not have plenty of experience with it, let me just quickly write a line of code to show you how you enter data inside of Firebase database. So I have launched the app over here, and inside of the build method, I'm going to write Firestore and press enter. Then if you come over to the top, notice that it has included Cloud Firestore dependency. Now if I append a dot after Firestore, it lists two variables. And this basically means that Firestore essentially provides us with two variables of type method channel, namely instance and channel. And in order to communicate with Firebase, we need to get its instance. So I'm going to write instance. Then we can call a collection function which accepts a string. And whatever you type here will be the name of our collection. For now, I'll write users. And I'll add another dot and call the document function. Now, in order to put some data in your DB, you need to call the setData function, and it accepts a map. Now, a map is simply a data structure which holds the data using a key-value pair. So to define a map, I'm going to be using these curly braces. Just like we use square braces to define an array, we use curly braces to define a map. And then inside of the map, we need to provide a key and a value. So for the key, I will write name, followed by a colon, and then the value for this key is going to be the CS guy. Now, if you're unfamiliar with collections and documents and NoSQL databases, then I would suggest you to take a look at Firebase's official YouTube channel to know more about them in detail, or just follow along. It might take some time, but you'll start to understand it as I'll implement the same thing again and again in different ways. Now, I will come over to the database section and click on this button called Create Database. Firebase also provides another type of database, but we are not going to be using that. Now, once the database has been created, I'm going to go back to VS Code and click R to hot reload the app. And this executes the line of code that we just wrote. But nothing changes inside of our console. Well, that's because when you make a collection, it does not refreshes automatically. So I'm going to reload the page and wait for it. And there we go. We have our first collection with the name users, and instead of that, I have some random string, which then contains the data that we provided. Great. Now let's start with the authentication, and I'll keep on explaining whenever it's necessary. So first, I will give a title to material app called Skype clone. Set banner mode to false. So the way this will work is we'll check whether someone is already logged in or not. If someone is logged in, then we show them the home screen, or else we show them the login screen. So I will come inside of the repository and I'll write class Firebase repository, and I will create a class called Firebase methods inside of Firebase methods.dart. Then inside of the repository, I'll create an object of this class and initialize it. Now I will create a function and name it getCurrentUser, and it is a feature of type Firebase user. Firebase user is a class which is present inside of Firebase auth, so we'll need to import that as well. After that, I'll mark it asynchronous. Then I will write Firebase user current user. So at the top here, I will create an instance of class Firebase auth and name it auth, and I'll mark it as final since we won't be changing its value. And I will initialize it to Firebase auth.instance to get the instance of that class. Now, instead of our function, I'm going to await for current user using auth.currentUser. And if you hover over this function, you can see that it returns a feature of type Firebase user. And thus, we have made our function of the same type as well. Then I'll simply return current user. After that, I'll go to the repository, create a method with the same return type as that of getCurrentUser. In fact, I'm going to give it the same name, and then it returns Firebase methods.getCurrentUser. Alright, so now we are able to get the current user. Now, how to make use of it? Well, remember that it returns a future. So we are going to be making use of a widget called FutureBuilder to extract that future. So I'm going to come back to main.dart and pass FutureBuilder widget as home for our material app. Then it accepts a future. And we'll pass the getCurrentUser function of our repository class. Then I'll write builder, and it returns a context and a snapshot. And just to make it clear about the type of snapshot we're receiving, I'm going to write async snapshot of type Firebase user. And the builder knows about the type of snapshot that we're receiving, as it infers the type of the future that we are passing to it. For example, if I would change this from Firebase user to a string, it starts showing this red squiggly lines. Then we perform a simple check. So if the user is logged in, then the snapshot that we'll receive would have some data, or else it's just going to be null. So I'll write if snapshot.hasData, then return home screen, or else return login screen. Now we need to create this home screen and login screen. So for that, I'll create a folder and name it screens. Then inside of this folder, I will create a file called homescreen.dart. And then inside of this homescreen.dart, I'll simply import material package and create a stateless widget, which simply returns a center text home screen. Then I'll create another file called loginscreen.dart. Inside of this, I will import the material package and create a stateful widget and name it login screen. Now I'll go back to main.dart and import both of those files. Alright, now that we have dealt with all the errors, I'm going to come inside of the login screen, and I'm going to start off by creating an instance of Firebase repository class over here and initialize it like this. Then I will come inside of the build method and return a scaffold widget and pass a login button function as body, as we're going to be having just this widget inside of the entire screen. Then I'll create a function of type widget, and it returns a flat button, which obviously is a widget. And I'll give it a padding of 35, pass a text as a child which says login, and I'll give some styling to this text. So I'll set its font size to 25, font weight to font weight.900, and letter spacing to 1.2. And for unpressed, I'm going to return perform login. Then just below this widget, I'm going to create another function called perform login and leave it empty for now. So let's start working on the sign-in function. So I'm going to come over to the Firebase methods.dart, and I will create a function which returns a future of type Firebase user. Since it's a future, I'm going to mark it as async. Then at the top of the file, I'll create a Google Sign-in class object. So I'll write Google Sign-in equal Google Sign-in. And I'll also create a Firestore instance by writing static final Firestore equal Firestore.instance. So every time when we perform any backend related operation, we won't have to write firestore.instance dot something. Like I showed you earlier, we can just use this firestore variable to access all those functions. Now I'll come back to the signin method and I'll write Google signin account equal await Google signin dot signin. So we use the Google signin class to access the signin function. And if you hover over it, it tells you that this function starts the interactive sign-in process, which means that this function is basically responsible for showing us that Google sign-in block on our screen, and we wait for the user's response. After the user provides a response, it is then stored in this variable. After that, we'll retrieve the Google sign-in authentication for the user using this line of code. And now I'll write auth.signin with credential. This is basically the only line which is required to sign in the user, and it returns a Firebase user. So I will assign it to Firebase user and return this user back. But we still have an error. That's because this function expects an auth credential. And to retrieve an auth credential, I'll write final auth credential Google Auth Provider dot get credential. And this get credentials requires an access token and an ID token. So I'll write access token. And to get the access token, we'll make use of the sign-in authentication. So I'll write sign-in authentication dot access token. Then for ID token as well, I'll write ID token sign-in authentication dot ID token. Now I will make a function with the same name and return type instead of the Firebase repository dot dart, and it returns this sign-in function from the Firebase methods. Inside of the perform login function, I'll write repository dot sign-in. And it returns a future. So we'll make use of the then callback to retrieve a user of type Firebase user. And I'll check that if the user is not null, which means that sign-in was performed successfully. Therefore, we authenticate the user. And authentication basically means that whether the user is trying to sign in or sign up, because either way the user is going to press this button. And I'll also write something for the else part. I'll just log that there was an error. After that, I'll create the void authenticate user function over here, and it receives a Firebase user. So I'll go back to Firebase methods, and I'll create a function which will return a future of type bool, and I'll name it authenticate user. The authenticate user function takes a Firebase user, and I'll mark it as async. The reason why all these functions are asynchronous is because all these functions depend upon network requests, which in itself is asynchronous, as it can fluctuate. And they take some time in returning the results as opposed to the results which depend upon calculating some values and returning it back. Alright, so in here I'll create a query snapshot and name it result. Then I will await for the results which are returned to us by this query. By the way, this is how you query a Firestore database for information. So I'm going to write firestore.collection and the name of the collection, which is going to be users. And now I will put some conditions over here. So I'll write where email is equal to user.email.getDocuments. Now, the collection part is similar to what I showed you in the earlier example. After that, we are just putting a condition. So this query will return with a list of documents that follow a specific condition. In this case, we are telling Firebase to return all those documents where the email field is equal to the email of the user that we have just passed. Now, to retrieve the list of documents for this query, I will write final list of type document snapshot, name it docs, and initialize it to result.documents. Great. Now think about it. If the user that we are passing is already registered, then the length of the list that we receive is going to be greater than 0. Or else, if he's not registered, then the length of the list would be 0. So either you could use an expanded version of if-else or use the ternary operators. So I'm going to do this with ternary operator. So I'll write return true if docs.length is equal 0 or else return false. I'll add this function inside of the Firebase repository just like this. And notice that it takes a user and then passes on the user to authenticate user function in Firebase methods.dart. So instead of the authenticate user of login screen.dart, I'll write repository.authenticate user and pass the user. And since it returns a future, therefore I could use a then callback to retrieve a boolean value. And we check that if the value is true, it means that the user is pressing this button for the very first time. which means that we need to sign him up and add his details to the DB. So I'll again write repository.addData to DB, and I'll pass in this user. And instead of a then callback, I'll return a value, and then we'll simply navigate the user to home screen. Similarly, in the else part, which means that the user is already registered, we'll just navigate the user to home screen. Now, let's add some data to the DB. So I'll first create this function inside of the repository, and again it accepts a Firebase user, and then passes it to the function that we are about to make inside of the Firebase methods.dart. So I'll come inside of the Firebase methods, and I've created this function of type future, and it accepts a Firebase user, current user, and I've also marked it as async. Now remember how you enter data in Firestore. You write firestore.collection users.document some document, and then we use the setData function, which then takes a map. Well, we are going to do the same thing but in a better way. So first I'll create a user model. So I'm going to create a folder called models and then create a file called user.dart, and I'll just paste some code over here. So we have a class called user, and I have defined several fields. So our user will have a UID or user ID, a name, an email, a username, status, a state, and profile photo. And then I have initialized all these fields over here. Then these two functions are responsible for either converting the user model into a map or retrieving the user model from a map. So inside of the map function, I have passed in the user that I wish to convert into a map. And I've created a map variable, so for every key I have provided a different value. And then I have simply returned this map. Then this from map function is basically a static function for this class, and we simply pass a map and create a user object from it. Great. Now that we have our user model, I'm going to come at the very top of Firebase methods file and create an instance of the user class. You can see that it automatically imports our model file. Then I'll come inside of this add data function, initialize this user instance just like this. Then for the UID, I'll pass current user.uid. Then set email to current user.email, name to display name, and profile photo to current user.photo URL. These are all the member variables provided to us by the Firebase user class. And then we need a username. Also, we want everyone's username to be unique. So for that, I will create a folder at the same level where we created the screens folder and name it utils. Then I will create a file called utilities.dart. And inside of this file, I will create a class named utils. Then I will create a static function of string type and name it getUsername. And we receive the user's email as an argument. Now, if you don't know, then usernames on Skype are started using live followed by your email without provider. And we'll try to do the same. So I will simply return live $mail dot split at 0. What the split function does is that it splits the string in two parts at a given pattern. In this case, that pattern is the @ sign. So now the first part contains only the email, and we just retrieve that email using 0. Coming back to the Firebase methods.dart, I'll just write string username equal utils.getUsername and pass the current user's email. Then I will pass the username over here, and I'll write firestore.collection users.document current user.uid.setData user.toMap user. In my earlier examples, we just kept this document function empty, because of which the name of the document which was generated was random. But this time we would need to know the name of the document as we want to query our database. Alright, that's it. Now I will launch the app, and notice that we don't have any data in our database, and we haven't defined any fields or collection by default. And that is the amazingness of Firebase, that you don't need to have any predefined data set. Now I will click on this login button, and it pops up this sign in block and lists all the registered accounts on my device. Then I will select my account, and after a few seconds it navigates me to the home screen. And if I reload this page, there we go. We have a collection named users, then it has a document with my user ID, and then this document contains all my data such as my username, name, profile photo, and everything else. And if you come over to the authentication section, it shows you the amount of users you have and the provider which they use to sign up on your app. There you go. So we have finally implemented some authentication in our app. In the next video, I'm going to start off by working on the home screen which the user sees as soon as he logs in. So if you enjoyed this video, then make sure to like and comment about it. And if you're new, then don't forget to subscribe, as I'm constantly working on bringing more and more awesome content on this course and on Flutter. By the way, the link to the project repository is present in the description below, so you can check that out as well. And you might want to start that repository so as to receive direct updates on GitHub as soon as I create a new branch or push some code. Right then, see you soon.